All right, everybody, welcome back to Seattle Budget School here on Converge Media. My name is Omari Salisbury, joined by Kevin Schofield of SCC Insight.
It's great to be back, and we get to dive into numbers today.
I've never met somebody so excited about the budget.
Numbers,
It's almost like when Director Wise from King County Elections, man, it's like it's all elections. You know what I'm saying? So much energy about elections. I know you anything city council, almost anything. You get right into it. We've been going through different things. Man, we talked about what the budget is. We talked about the budget and the law. We talked about the process. Today, I want you to show me the money.
Yeah, we're going to do the money. Today, we're going to do the revenue side of this. We're going to look at all the money that's coming in the door for the city.
All right, let's get right into it, man. I mean, if you can tell me where is, I really want to know this too. And I'm really glad. This is the episode I'm looking forward to. I know after this, the next episode is expenses. I want to know where this money is coming into the city.
Okay, well, we will break it down. Absolutely, yeah. So altogether, next year, they're forecasting about $6.6 billion of revenues for the city. Now, there's some caveats to that, so let's break that down a little bit here. Almost $2.8 billion of that is in the city's two utilities, Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities, about $1.4 billion each of that. And that's, all the bills that we pay. That's our, power and garbage and sewer and water bills that go into that. And other than setting rates, the city council really doesn't get any control over those revenues. They have to stay within those businesses. So we're really not going to talk that much about what's going on with those today. But that's a big chunk of the $6.6 billion. There are, some other things in there: bond revenues, interest on money that the city's got in the bank, and then, investments on the, the employee retirement plans and things like that. Internal transfers, between departments are counted in that too. So, for example, when Seattle IT bills, the police department for IT services, that actually shows up as revenues, and it's all internal money. So it's a little weird, but they account for everything, so it's in there too. And then there's what the city calls general fund revenues, which are dollars that they raise, mostly through taxes, that the city can spend on pretty much anything that it wants and move around between different parts of the budget. So that's the best kind of money for the city council. They love their general fund money, and they talked about it a lot. And that's about $1.4 billion. And then the remainder is what you could think of as restricted use revenues, things like the Seattle Parks District, the Transportation Benefit District, some of our property taxes, taxes on real estate transactions, taxes where the city council has passed laws restricting how the money can be used, such as the new payroll tax and the street and beverage tax.
Right. Well, it sounds like if you really want to get in the money and play with the money, then it's in the general fund.
Yeah, so that's right. City council's hands are tied the least on spending that money. So the interesting thing about general fund revenues is that 85% of it, about $1.2 billion out of that 1.4, comes from just 4 sources: property taxes, sales taxes, B&O taxes, and utility taxes, right? And this is where we start to see some of the tough policy decisions involved in how the city raises revenues, right? Property taxes and sales taxes are regressive taxes. Low-income people pay a larger share of their income in those taxes than higher-income people do, right? But it's almost $700 million in revenues for the city, right? And because of, as we talked about before, because the city can only pass taxes that the state authorizes it to pass, it really doesn't have a lot of choice about the kinds of taxes that it passes for this sort of thing. So it's stuck getting a lot of its money from regressive tax sources. Now, B&O taxes, business and occupation taxes, which are taxes paid by businesses, they aren't regressive, but they are a part of the equation about what makes a place attractive for businesses to start up, to run, to hire more employees, to grow and thrive. So if you raise B&O taxes and other taxes on business too high, you're going to end up with fewer businesses, right? And if you put them too low, then you can't pay for all the infrastructure it takes to really support all those businesses. So you've got to find like the sweet spot in the middle on that. And then there's utility taxes. These are the taxes that the city imposes on Comcast, Puget Sound Energy, CenturyLink, but also on Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities. And that's really interesting because we like to tell ourselves that Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities, they're owned by the city, they're kind of run as nonprofits, or at least sort of not profit-making sort of centers. They're kind of being run on a break-even basis. But that isn't really true, because by putting a utility tax on those businesses, the city government, City Hall, is extracting out revenues that they can spend on other things from those. And those are general fund revenues that they can spend on pretty much anything that they want.
All right, so maybe you can tell me, how are restricted use revenues different?
Right. So that's a great question. The restricted use revenues tend to come from a larger set of smaller sources. There's one big exception to that, though, which is the recently passed payroll tax that is expected to bring in about $235 million next year. Beyond that, there's a couple of kind of $50 million sources. And then there's a lot of, $5 to $10 million sources, things like, sweet and beverage tax is about $20 million. There are things like school zone camera funds, which are kind of in the $7 million range. So, there's a bigger variety of smaller things. But the hard thing to manage with the smaller ones is, if you really want to do something big, you can't really look to those, right? Because there's no way you can be able to sort of turn the dial on those in a way to generate enough money to do something big. You can go to one of those pots of money to do something small. If you need $250,000 for something, which sounds like a lot of money to you or me, but in a $6.6 billion budget, $250,000 is a rounding error, right? They didn't even notice that of money in there. So you can find that in the small pots of money, but if you really want to do something big, you have to go to a big pot of money to find it.
Ryan, why is the payroll tax restricted use?
Yeah, so that's a great question, too. Now, remember earlier when we talked about how the city only has the authority to impose taxes that the state government authorizes it to do? This is where that really comes into play. Sometimes the state just grants taxing authority and lets cities figure out what to do with the money. And they do that generally with property taxes, right? And sometimes it places restrictions on how those tax revenues are to be used. So Seattle's restricted use revenues are really kind of a mix of both of those. On one hand, school zone cameras are authorized by the state, which says the money must be spent on school traffic safety investments. And there's another kind of restricted use called real estate excise tax that must be spent on infrastructure projects or on affordable housing. But for other Seattle taxes, it's restricted use because the city council decided that they wanted to make it restricted use. So the payroll tax, you may remember that there was a dust up between the mayor and the city council about how to spend the payroll tax revenues. So what the city council did was they actually passed an ordinance where all the payroll taxes went into a specific fund that had restricted uses. And that really tied the mayor's hands. And they did a very similar thing with the sweet and beverage tax, with the soda tax, saying this is all that money is going to go into fund, and it can only be used for very specific things. So sometimes the state says it's restricted, and sometimes the city council makes it restricted themselves.
All right, so it sounds like some of this stuff the city is guessing on, right? Because you got a beverage tax. Like, how do they know? People just aren't going to stop drinking, things with sugar in it.
Yeah.
And if you get the cameras and on all these things, these revenues from there, then maybe less people drive, or they like to slow down now in school zones. So it seems like there's a lot of maybe guessing, maybe educated guessing that goes into this. How often do they get it right?
Yeah, so actually they have a really good track record of the city for very, very accurate forecasts of these things. They have a set of economists on staff at the city who work very closely with their counterparts in the State Office of Economic Forecasts at the state of Washington to model and predict revenues. And they use a number of different economic indicators that in the past have tracked really well with those tax revenues. I will say that the last couple of years have been super tough for them, right? Because COVID just turned everything upside down for them. The economy shut down, and we went into this massive recession faster than we've ever gone into one before. And now we're on the path to economic recovery, which is great, but there's still a lot of debate about how quickly we're going to recover from that. So, for example, this is the data the city is looking at for sales tax revenues. In some areas, it's actually above pre-pandemic levels, but leisure and hospitality, as you can see here, basically hotels and restaurants, are still only about 50% of where they were in 2019. And that matches up with data from the restaurant industry on the number of diners they're seeing at restaurants. You can see here, right, that whereas across the country, it's coming back up to about 100% of pre-pandemic levels, we're still only about 50% here in Seattle, right? So those numbers all, they can take these multiple kind of data points and look at them and go, yeah, okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. At this point, that's looking like about 50% still for hospitality industry. Now, B&O revenues, tax revenues on businesses, is looking pretty good this year, and the IT sector in particular is really kind of saving our butts this year. You can see that's been a huge win this year. But you can see that hotel and restaurant industry is still not looking that great in there. And really surprisingly, just in the last couple of months, construction has started to cool off again too. So it's really kind of a mix. And we can see more of the construction stuff just looking at some of the month-to-month data in this next chart here. For example, with employment, a lot's changing really quickly. And employment in the hotel and restaurant industries has actually really started to pick up over the summer. And that's not surprising given that we started opening up restaurants again at the beginning of the summer. So they're starting to hire again. They're still way below where they were pre-pandemic, but it's starting to pick up again. But like I mentioned a minute ago, for some reason over the summer, construction actually kind of ticked back down a little bit. And nobody's quite sure what's going on with that, but it's a little worrisome for folks. And one of the things that makes that really important, that the city's really come to understand over the last few years, is that a really big chunk of the city's revenues, about $100 million every year, is derived from the construction industry. We saw that in some of the charts we just looked at, right? Construction employment, sales taxes from construction, B&O taxes paid by the construction industry. City government is very dependent on all those construction cranes that we see downtown or other parts of the city. And that's pretty scary at the moment because construction really cratered during the pandemic and it hasn't fully recovered yet. And one of the key indicators the city looks at is the number of new construction permits that are being filed, because permits that it's seeing being filed now gives it a really good idea of the number of construction projects that are going to be worked on a year or 2 or 3 years from now, right? So it's kind of predicting the future part of this. What they see people filing for now is what's going to get built a couple of years ago. And definitely it's true the other way around. If they're not filing for it now, they're definitely not going to be building it 2 years from now, right? So there was a spike at the beginning of the year. You can see a really, really big spike there. And there are a couple of those spikes before that. Those big spikes tend to happen just before a new set of construction regulations go into play. Everybody's trying to get grandfathered into the old rules first. And there was one of those at the beginning of the year. And then right after that, permits have really kind of dropped off again. And within the permits, if you look at it, and I wrote a story about this a few months back, it's almost all residential construction, which is great for housing. We need a ton more housing. It's great. But commercial construction has almost disappeared. For the last couple of years, there really haven't been very many commercial construction permits filed. So there's a big concern about whether we're actually going to manage to maintain the amount of revenues this city is dependent upon from the construction industry in the city. And one last chart I want to share with you here, and that's for real estate excise tax, or what they call REIT. Now, the REIT is a tax that's paid whenever a property changes hands. So if I sell a property to you, then we have to pay REIT excise tax to the city for that, right? So that often happens at the end of a construction project, but it also happens every time a building is sold. So the one thing that does for REIT is it makes REIT super unpredictable. And you can see it bounces up and down a lot from year to year because you never know when some big office tower downtown is going to get sold. It's a huge, huge windfall every time, the Bank of America building or something like that changes hands, but you can't ever predict that. So they make some predictions based upon kind of general flow every year they see a real estate transaction, but they don't really know for sure. And so what that means is that it's a difficult thing to budget on the revenue side, but it's also difficult to plan for how they want to spend that money because they don't know how much there's going to be next year for sure, right? So it's really great for one-time expenses. And if they get like early on in the year, a big office tower sale and they get a bunch of extra, they can decide in the middle of the year, oh great, we've got extra REIT revenues this year. We can spend on a lot of stuff. And it's really good for one-time expenses like, okay, we're gonna do this transportation project. We're gonna fix up the street or add these sidewalks. But it's really bad for ongoing programs and ongoing expenses because you can't predict how much of it you're gonna have in future years.
Mhm. I was still thinking about you selling me some property. working on
I got a bridge in Arizona. You interested?
All right, so next week the mayor rolls out our budget. What can we expect?
Well, we're here with Dr. Ben Noble, the city budget director for the city of Seattle. Director Noble, thanks for being with us today.
Total pleasure.
Great. So why don't we start by just telling us a bit about your team, who's on your team, and what is it that you do?
Thanks. Yeah, so it's a team of about 40. The largest group of them are budget analysts who are assigned to individual departments, or for some of the smaller departments, multiple departments. And they work closely with both the finance teams in those departments and then also their policy teams, because the proposals, the financial proposals, the budget proposals that we ultimately review are a mix of the policy work and the money needed to support them. We also have so that's the bulk of the folks, and they have backgrounds in policy and finance. Many trained here in Seattle at the Evans School for Public Policy. We also have some economists, a team of folks who've been involved in the revenue forecasting, because the revenue forecast is itself based on an understanding of the local economy. We understand through time essentially the correlations between how much, if there's income growth and employment growth in the city, what does that mean for city revenues? And you can't build a budget without knowing what you think your revenues are going to be. So, and pretty good track record on that front. So they're critical folks. And then we have the city has an innovation and policy team as well that has been part of the budget office for the last 2 years. They're less involved in directly building the budget and more in some of the evaluation and policy work that we support as well. A team of working managers to help wrap that all up, and a deputy director who helps keep this thing actually working. I spend a lot of time doing these sorts of things, sort of being outward faced, and there's the management is a real challenge. Not that people are difficult, but it's an amazing coordination process. The budget document runs past 1,000 pages, and it's all iterative in complicated ways. The budget for one department become the revenues for another, so you have to bring it all together. And I've been watching that happen to reach its peak over the last 2 weeks, and it's an amazing bit of coordination. I'm not bragging because I let other people do it. My only smarts is letting other people do it.
So we're coming up on the release of the mayor's proposed 2022 budget. When did your team start working on it? And maybe sort of give us a little bit of a view, like what these last 2 weeks have been for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, we start this way at the beginning of the year. I mean, really, we do some year-end work from the previous year into February, but then we immediately start looking ahead to the next year. So for us, this is almost an endless process. So budget is passed in November or late, and then we do some cleanup in December and January, and then gear up again. Process starts with us looking at it's then the current year budget as we start to build the budget for the following year. And we do what we call a baseline process. So we look and see, okay, what are the stuff that's in this year's budget that just makes sense to have in next year's budget? So, the fire department is probably going to function largely as it does this year as it does next. So what's the cost of that? And that cost will change. We'll have the labor agreement that means wages are going to increase. Fuel costs might be going up. They might be facing a year where they need a bunch more equipment. Their equipment gets replaced on some regular cycle. Then that's just one example. So that's our first phase. We then get a revenue forecast, and I know you track those, and there's probably been some discussion about that previously. We prepare the first revenue forecast in April. We begin in just kind of February, and in March and in April, we start to engage the departments to say, hey, we know what your baseline looks like. We know what it's going to take to do what you're doing this year, what it will take to do that same thing next year. But what changes are you looking at? Is there, what policy priorities do you have? Are there some things you don't need to be doing that could save us some money? So we start those discussions in that same March, April timeframe. And then we get the forecast in April, usually about mid part of April. And that's a revenue forecast for the following year if it's the biennial year for a couple of years. And that sets the tone for the work that follows, because if the revenue forecast shows us that revenues are growing, we can have a conversation with departments about, well, what good ideas do you have about things that the public might be interested in? If it's the opposite, we have to have a more difficult conversation and set a conversation. Okay, we're going to spend less. What's the path here? And at the same time that we're engaging the departments, we're also engaging the mayor's office and other policy folks in the city about, what else is going on. We're hearing from council what their priorities are. Among the things we do is track the legislation that's either getting passed or is prospectively likely to get passed. Just an example of if city council, and this is a real example, is looking at passing some new labor law regulations, those will likely have some costs to implement. So we need to be aware and looking ahead. So that sets the tone in April. We then give departments till June to make formal proposals. So we get their technical proposals in June. As part of that initial discussion with the departments in April, we also engage the mayor, him or herself, or most recently herself, and get her feedback so that when we're talking to departments, we know that we're speaking with authority, if you will. Get their formal proposals in June and then really start cranking. June, July, August, really cranking hard, and then into September. So we get the formal proposals, we're working through them, seeing how they can be making recommendations. We know what the financial constraints are on the revenue forecast. So if all the things that are being asked for the departments, if we try to put them together, which of these things do we want to try to do? So we make recommendations to mayor's senior staff, to the deputy mayors, to the mayor herself. That's a process that runs into July. And then ultimately we get another revenue forecast beginning of August, which again, and then delivered to council in that same time frame. And that's the basis for the final decision. So we've made some preliminary decisions in July with the mayor, final revenue forecast, and then the final decisions. And then, so that's second, third week of August. And then we start trying to pull it all together. And as we do, I don't know if there are errors, but we start to see how some of the things are linked. There's some late breaking changes. And then we have to write the book. So we try to explain this to everybody and fully recognizing that nobody, I have to admit myself included, maybe you're the exception, reads the 1,000+ pages, but we're reviewing it. We write the things so you can read a chapter at a time and get some sense, because basically each chapter is a department, so you can get a sense of what's going on with the department. But there is an overview as well. So we're tying all those pieces together and checking that all the numbers work. And then working on some of the communication pieces, which I appreciate your help on this front, actually, because we work hard also to write up some summary documents that we can share out. And then we switch to deliver the budget on this Monday coming, so the last Monday in September. And then there's usually, as this year, a week of presentations from the departments to the council about their budgets. And then we get into a question and answer phase and really try to help the council through its deliberations. We actually have a formal process about the way questions are posted and answered, just to provide complete transparency so that everybody can see the same answers and the like, and that we can provide some coordination.
So you mentioned budget forecast, sort of revenue forecast a couple of times. 2020 and this year have been a really interesting time to try to predict city revenues with the pandemic and the shutdowns around that, and now the economic recovery, we hope. As you go into 2022, how are you thinking about the revenue situation?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I've been joking. I have a doctorate in economics. It's the thing I did in previous life, but I've joked that we need to have some doctors on our forecast team. I meant medical doctors because it feels like that's the driver of late. Of course, no one's been good at predicting that. So, I mean, the story for this year has been actually that the recovery hit better and harder, if you will, faster than we and really anyone had forecast. So, and that was running up through July, right? So the stimulus from the federal government really did make a difference. And I think as importantly, the economy adapted more quickly than a lot of folks had anticipated. We did not, hospitality sector devastated. So I'm not trying to minimize the impacts to certain sectors, but others have continued on. And actually tech sector seems to be taking advantage, if you will. So, the revenue forecast we produced in August was based on data from July. So we take we look at the actual receipts from the city for tax revenues. We look at state level employment, local employment, and then we also get a national forecast because the local economy is ultimately, again, the driver of city revenues. And the local economy is not an island from the national economy. So it is really key to understand the national forecasts, and because they, again, are a key input. And so we built forecasts for all that were balanced to in July based on what we knew in July. And obviously the Delta variant has been a growing issue. And we've had this dialogue with council and publicly. There is, the way I've described it, I think there's some potential softness in the forecast. So the way the budget process works, and I didn't quite get there in my narrative before, there's a final update to the forecast, the revenue forecast that we deliver to council in very first part of November, and that's what they use to balance. And I think there's a prospect that will be a slight downgrade in the forecast, again, based on what we're seeing. But we built the budget knowing that. So look some places where some of the spending could get reduced without significant impacts. The particular thing that we're seeing, and maybe just a one data point that we showed the council last week that sort of captures this, the level of traffic through Seatac was growing strongly through, from sort of May, June, July. I can show you a nice upward trajectory, and it's plateaued, right? It's not that it's gone back down, but it's not growing. And that particular sector, hospitality particularly, and tourism, is probably not going to rebound as quickly as we had assumed. It's only one sector in the overall economy, and it's certainly the one that's been hit hardest. So we're obviously tracking that closely.
You also showed some data that showed that looks like construction employment might be just wavering a little bit over the summer. And one of the things we talk about in the budget school is how, and you've mentioned this in many of your presentations in past years, that the city's revenues are remarkably dependent upon construction. So what are you thinking about that right now?
Yeah, no, you've highlighted another one, another potential area of concern. So again, I think of construction as being two related but separate sectors: residential and construction, and commercial. In commercial, particularly thinking about office, right? There's obviously a lot of uncertainty about the demand for office space. The workplace of the future is unknown all of a sudden. There are a lot of projects underway. Nature of construction financing, fully expect them to finish out. But we're also aware of others that are coming online. So I think that's a longer term issue, longer term being a year or more. And the residential sector remains quite strong. So the way we judge that, or we try to forecast, one of the key inputs of sort of forecasting that is looking at the permits that come through the construction and inspection department, SDCI, and we have seen the value of those permits requested to decline some, but that's not a perfect indicator. So, but that is another area of potential concern. If the issue though is Delta, thought is that that's sort of a delay in when we recover, and the construction stuff is really a longer term question. And this is just it's an anecdotal point. The couple real estate transactions recently around office space suggest that the market considers office space extremely valuable. And if it's extremely valuable, then someone will build more of it.
That's a good point. And on the side, he got some really good REIT dollars out of that as well.
Exactly. Yes, there's a tax on real estate transactions, and the sale of those does help. And actually, our forecast for real estate excise tax doesn't show any decline because, interestingly, whatever the current economic crisis is not a financial crisis. During the last deep recession, which was significantly around financial issues, real estate transactions stopped because people had trouble accessing capital. Not true now. And so yeah, I mean, residential market, prime example, right? You can get a home loan.
Booming, yeah.
Exactly, and the revenues from the real estate excise tax, it's price times quantity. So we're benefiting as the prices go up, and quantity hasn't. I mean, the number of transactions hasn't declined. The number of houses on the market at any given time is low, but that's just because the pace is seemingly insane.
So what else should people know about the budget process to help them better understand their city government?
Um, a few things. I mean, one is that one thing to remember is that we talk a lot about the general fund, and I certainly talk all about the general fund, and that is a segment of the budget that is the most flexible, and it pays for a lot of the things that people, I think, associate with local government. So parks and libraries and police and fire. But it is important to know that the overall budget is much larger because Seattle Public Utilities and City Light are each now $1 billion plus operations. And I think, honestly, I think some people don't realize that we have a public electric utility, and it's really a wonderful editorial comment. That's a very unusual.
And we've talked about all of that in budget school. So
Great. So I think people don't know about that and should pay attention. The other is to know that in the way that I described the base budget process, a lot of the budget is just continuing what we're doing, and like to think we're doing a reasonable job of it. So like, the fire department, it's a labor intensive. There are more than 1,000 firefighters, and they are there when you need them. And that budget doesn't change a whole lot. So a good part of the city's budget isn't changing year to year. And that's not a bad thing. Again, people may have different assessments of how good the service we provide, but that's kind of a backbone piece. I think another to recognize is that unless someone is bringing a new proposal for a revenue source, once the budget is on the table, it's a zero-sum exercise. So as you're advocating for something, and I'm not discouraging anyone from getting involved in advocating. Quite the opposite. As you know, I worked on the city council side for multiple years, and I really enjoy watching that engagement process. But it is important to know that it's zero sum. So if we're going to balance some new ad, there's something else that is not going to get done. And one of the more compelling things I've actually seen, and I've heard people come to testify at public hearings, and they intended to testify about something that they thought was very important, and had heard several other people come up and identify something else, and they get to the microphone and say, I was going to tell you about X, but I just listened to Y, and you know what? That's actually more important. And that is a compelling, and that is part of the process, is to realize that it's really hard. Everybody in Seattle, and address a wide variety of needs. And I talk about this with my team, and ultimately I'm not the decider, and thankfully so at some level, because we are on any given day, there's a request from the fire department to do X and a request from the human services department to do Y, and it's the same sources that would fund them. And comparing X and Y can be, it's a very difficult process, and there's no magical logic to it. It is a lot of judgment, and it's why it's also important who you elect to those offices, because those are ultimately the decision makers. And
well, we really appreciate your time. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
No, that was all. I just and I do appreciate the engagement. I think it's really important for folks to get involved and to better understand this piece of things. And the budget office and myself readily available to answer questions. Hard to answer every constituent question, but really do but really want to help engage. And I do. People manage to find my phone number and my email, and when I can, I respond directly, and happy to do it. Because again, I think that's important. We work. I'm an appointee of the mayor. Work for the executive, but the ethos of the folks on my team is that we're working for the city and we're working for the residents here, and that's the work that we really enjoy.
Great, Dr. Ben Noble, City Budget Director. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
All right, good stuff. All right, Kevin, I told you, show me the money.
Did I show you enough money though?
Yeah, the money is cool.
And complicated though. It is complicated.
And I got a feeling that the next episode is probably going to be where the money's going.
Yep. Yeah, we're going to talk about expenses. We're going to talk about the other side, what's going out the door.
All right, good stuff. Kevin Schofield, thank you for joining us. And of course, you, the viewing audience. This has been another episode of Seattle Budget.